In a quiet neighborhood, Sarah Turner's peaceful life is interrupted when she notices her pool is mysteriously dirty every time she cleans it. As the trespassers keep coming, Sarah takes bold steps to protect her privacy. Will her efforts succeed? Find out in this gripping story on Voices of the Underdog. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Sarah Turner had always prided herself on her independence and the comfortable life she had built for herself. As an interior designer, her work was her passion, and her home was the manifestation of her success and personality. Nestled in a quiet residential neighborhood, Sarah's house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, surrounded by well-maintained gardens and towering trees that provided a sense of seclusion from the world beyond. The house itself was charming, a mix of modern design with classic touches, and it had all the amenities she needed for a peaceful life. The highlight of Sarah's property was undoubtedly the swimming pool. It wasn't an extravagant, resort-like pool, but it was perfect for her, a private sanctuary where she could unwind after long hours of work, a place to soak up the sun during the summer or to cool off after a busy day. The pool was well maintained, and Sarah made it a point to clean it regularly, ensuring it was always in pristine condition. She even had a routine: scrub the tiles, check the filtration system, skim off any debris, and balance the chemicals in the water. The smell of chlorine mixed with the fresh air from the trees always brought a sense of tranquility. And as she sat by the pool's edge, it was easy to forget the world around her. However, lately, something had started to bother Sarah, something small but persistent. Every time she finished cleaning the pool and took a step back to admire her work, the water sparkled and gleamed under the sun. But by the next morning, something was off. The once clear water was now cloudy, with a faint layer of debris floating near the surface. At first, Sarah thought it might have been due to the wind, maybe dust or pollen drifting into the pool from the trees. She'd been living here for years and never had this issue before, but it was possible that weather changes were having an effect she hadn't noticed. The first few times, she brushed it off. She simply cleaned the pool again, dismissing the thought that anything was amiss. The job took her less than an hour, so it wasn't an inconvenience to keep up with it. But each time she cleaned it, the same thing happened. The water would look pristine after she finished, only to become murky by the morning. It was almost as if someone had been in the pool, using it while she wasn't around. Sarah couldn't quite put her finger on why it bothered her so much. After all, it was just a pool, a minor inconvenience that didn't really impact her life in any significant way. Perhaps it was just a quirk of nature. Maybe the wind, the weather, or even animals in the neighborhood were responsible. She couldn't think of any other explanation, so she tried to let the feeling pass. But deep down, there was a sense of unease that she couldn't shake. It was as if her space had been invaded. Sarah was someone who valued her privacy, and her home was her sanctuary from the outside world. The thought that someone might be using her pool without permission made her feel violated, even though she had no concrete evidence of this. It was more of an intuition, an unspoken feeling that something wasn't quite right. Over the next week, Sarah continued to clean the pool, and each time, the same thing occurred. The water, once crystal clear, would turn murky again. Now, there was a feeling of tension that grew with each cleaning session. She tried to rationalize it, but the more she thought about it, the less it seemed like a simple coincidence. Someone, perhaps a neighbor, was using her pool when she wasn't around. But who would do such a thing? Sarah hadn't had any issues with her neighbors before. They were mostly quiet, respectful people who kept to themselves, just as she did. Still, the thought gnawed at her. Was it possible that one of them had been sneaking into her yard at night? It wasn't like she had a large fence or security cameras. Her backyard was fairly open, with only a few bushes and trees providing any kind of cover. And though Sarah lived in a nice neighborhood, she knew that didn't make her immune to petty crimes or trespassing. One evening, after cleaning the pool for what felt like the 100th time, Sarah sat on the edge of her patio, staring out at the water. She couldn't help but notice that the sun was already beginning to set, casting a soft orange glow across the surface of the pool. The evening air was cool, and for a moment she felt at ease again. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing thoughts. Perhaps she was overthinking things. Maybe the weather was simply causing the water to dirty faster than she had noticed before. Or perhaps animals were jumping into the pool, leaving debris behind. It would be foolish to jump to conclusions without any proof. After all, she had no idea what was causing the problem. There were so many possible explanations. Sarah stood up and walked toward the pool, running her fingers along the tiles. For the first time in days, she felt a moment of peace. Perhaps tomorrow, when she cleaned the pool again, everything would be back to normal. But as she turned to head back inside, a flicker of movement caught her eye. She froze. It was just a shadow, but it was moving in the direction of her backyard gate. Had someone just walked past? She couldn't be sure. Sarah squinted, trying to see if she could make out any more details. But the figure had already disappeared into the evening darkness. Shaking her head, Sarah stepped back inside, locking the door behind her. She tried to push the thought from her mind. It was likely nothing. Still, there was that nagging feeling again, that sense of something being wrong. Maybe it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. Maybe she was letting her suspicions get the better of her. The next morning, when Sarah went out to clean the pool once again, she found the water dirtier than ever before. This time, there was more debris, leaves, twigs, and even a few empty soda cans floating near the surface. Her heart sank. She had no choice now but to confront the issue head-on. This wasn't just the weather or animals. Someone had definitely been in her pool. Her suspicions had been right all along, and now she had to figure out who was doing it and why. It was time to take action. As the days passed, Sarah Turner grew increasingly frustrated. Each morning she would step outside to find the same disheartening sight, the once clear pool water, now sullied with debris, murky and uninviting. She had cleaned the pool with meticulous care each time, but no matter how much effort she put into maintaining it, the situation only seemed to worsen. The sense of violation she had begun to feel now weighed heavily on her. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a direct challenge to her personal space, her privacy. The more she thought about it, the more she became convinced that someone had been using her pool when she wasn't around. Sarah tried to convince herself that it was just a coincidence, that there was some rational explanation for the dirty water, perhaps the weather, or even animals. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. The recurring pattern was too consistent, too deliberate. It didn't take long before the nagging suspicion turned into a resolve to find out the truth. She couldn't keep ignoring the problem. It was time to take matters into her own hands. That afternoon, after another long day at work, Sarah stood in her kitchen, her gaze fixed on the empty pool in the backyard. The stillness of the water seemed almost mocking, as if it were taunting her, reminding her that someone was invading her space. She knew she had to take action now, but she wasn't sure how. How could she catch the person responsible? What could she do to prove it wasn't just her imagination? It was then that an idea struck her, a simple yet effective solution. Security cameras. Sarah had seen them in countless homes and businesses, discreetly positioned to monitor activity. She had never considered them for her own property before, but now, the thought seemed like the only logical course of action. If she could catch whoever was using her pool, she could finally put an end to the intrusion. Without wasting any time, Sarah went online and researched the best security cameras for residential use. She read reviews, compared models, and settled on a set of discreet, motion-activated cameras that could be easily hidden around her property. She wanted to be subtle. She didn't want to alert anyone to her surveillance. The last thing she wanted was for the intruder to find out she was watching. It was important to catch them in the act. The next day, she received the cameras and with great care, she began installing them around her backyard. She placed one by the pool, angled to cover the entire area, and another by the back gate, in case someone was entering from that side. Sarah also decided to install a third camera by the side of the house, pointing toward the garage and driveway, in case the culprit was entering through the side yard. She worked swiftly but efficiently, ensuring that everything was set up properly. Once the cameras were in place, Sarah felt a sense of satisfaction. It was a small but significant step toward regaining control over her space. Now, she just had to wait. The cameras would capture everything that happened in the yard, and she would finally have the evidence she needed. That evening, after a long day of work, Sarah settled into her living room, her eyes glued to the small screen of her laptop as she checked the camera footage. She had set up the cameras to record on a loop, overriding any previous footage once it filled up, so she knew she'd need to check them regularly. She clicked through the footage from the past few nights, her heart pounding in her chest. Would she finally get the answers she'd been looking for? At first, the footage seemed uneventful. Sarah watched as the video played, showing nothing but the empty backyard, the still pool, and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. But as she continued to scroll through the recordings, something caught her attention. There, in the dead of night, she saw movement. Figures appeared on the screen, shadowy figures that crept into her backyard through the side gate. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. These weren't just animals or the wind, these were people. As the video continued to play, Sarah could see the figures move toward the pool. Two individuals, one male and one female, crept along the edge of the pool, looking around nervously as though they were trying to avoid being seen. The male figure climbed over the side of the pool, and within moments, the two were splashing in the water. It was unmistakable. Someone had been sneaking into her pool, and now she had proof. Sarah watched in disbelief as the two intruders spent a good portion of the night swimming in her pool, completely unaware of the cameras capturing their every move. They laughed and joked with each other, completely at ease as if they owned the place. Sarah's anger swelled. She had been right all along. The once muted suspicion had now solidified into undeniable proof. Her neighbors were using her pool without her permission, and they had been doing so for some time. The next few nights, the same pattern repeated itself. Sarah watched as the same two people, who she now recognized as her next-door neighbors, continued to sneak into her backyard, ignoring the boundary she had set with her property. They didn't seem to care that they were trespassing, that they were invading her private space. The water was always left dirty, with leaves floating in the pool and sometimes even items like towels or personal belongings left behind. But it wasn't just the repeated intrusion that bothered Sarah. It was the sheer audacity of it. Her neighbors knew she was home. They must have seen her cleaning the pool countless times. Yet, they continued to disrespect her space, taking advantage of the privacy she had worked so hard to maintain. The intrusion wasn't just physical, it felt deeply personal, as if they were testing the boundaries of her life. As Sarah watched the footage play out before her, she felt a wave of emotions flood through her. Anger, frustration, disbelief, but there was also a sense of empowerment. She had the evidence now clear as day. She wasn't imagining things. Her neighbors were responsible for the mess, and they had been sneaking into her property for weeks. The time for excuses was over. Sarah knew she had to take action, but she wasn't sure what that action should be. Confronting them directly felt like a last resort. She didn't want to escalate the situation more than necessary. But at the same time, she couldn't allow this to continue. The peace and privacy she had once enjoyed in her home were being stripped away, and Sarah wasn't about to let that happen. Now that she had proof, Sarah began to carefully consider her options. She could take the footage to the authorities, but she wasn't sure if that would make the situation better or worse. She could confront her neighbors directly, but what if it led to conflict? The options were limited, and the consequences of each action loomed over her like a dark cloud. One thing was clear: she needed to stop the intrusion, but how? Sarah didn't yet have all the answers, but she knew one thing for certain: she would no longer be passive in this situation. She had the power to take control, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. The weight of Sarah's discovery lingered in her mind like a shadow, refusing to be shaken off. The images from the security footage replayed over and over in her head. Her neighbors, people she had waved to across the fence countless times, were trespassing in her backyard. They had made a mockery of her privacy, swimming in her pool as if it were theirs, ignoring her space as if it had no value. It was more than an inconvenience now. It was an outright violation of her home, her sanctuary. Sarah felt a tight knot in her chest, her sense of security shattered. But she wasn't going to stand idly by anymore. She had already gathered the evidence. Now it was time to act. The next morning, Sarah woke up early, determined to tackle the problem head-on. Her first priority was the pool area. She had to ensure that her neighbors, those intruders, could no longer sneak in. It was clear that the polite requests and hints she had offered in the past weren't enough. She needed to send a stronger message. She couldn't wait around hoping that things would magically get better. No, she was going to take control and protect her space, no matter what it took. Walking into her backyard, Sarah took a deep breath as she surveyed the pool area. It seemed calm now, as if nothing had ever been disturbed, but she knew the truth. The tranquility was an illusion. She walked over to the back gate, eyeing the rusty lock that had been there for years. It wasn't much, just a simple latch that could easily be undone by anyone with a little knowledge or determination. She had seen her neighbors slip through that gate before, their actions invisible to the world, but not anymore. The idea of locking her gate securely had crossed her mind a dozen times, but it wasn't just about preventing them from entering. It was about sending a message. This was her home, her private space, and no one had the right to infringe upon it without her consent. After some thought, Sarah decided to install a sturdy, high-quality lock that couldn't be easily bypassed. She opted for a heavy-duty padlock, the kind you'd find in a warehouse or a security-conscious facility, the kind that would make anyone think twice before attempting to break in. Sarah took her time installing the lock, testing it several times to ensure that it worked smoothly. She wanted it to be flawless. The last thing she needed was for the lock to malfunction at the wrong moment. She also made sure the lock was inconspicuous, blending in with the surroundings while still being solid enough to prevent unauthorized access. Once she was satisfied with the result, she stepped back and admired her work. The gate was secure. No one would be able to simply walk in anymore. It felt good, empowering even. But that was just the first step. Sarah knew she couldn't stop there. If her neighbors had been sneaking in through the gate, they might try other ways of accessing the pool area. She needed to make sure the entire pool area was protected. The next challenge would be reinforcing the perimeter of the pool itself. She thought about her options. She could install a fence, but that would be costly and time-consuming. Plus, the idea of a towering fence around her pool didn't appeal to her. It felt too harsh, too unwelcoming. It wasn't the look she wanted for her backyard, a place where she had always felt at peace. There had to be another solution. After a bit of brainstorming, Sarah decided on adding a layer of security that would be both functional and discreet: motion-activated lights. She had seen these lights at home improvement stores and had been impressed by their ability to deter intruders. These lights were designed to turn on as soon as someone crossed a certain threshold, flooding the area with bright light. It wasn't just a warning, it was a clear signal that someone was watching. And Sarah was betting that the sudden burst of light would be enough to make any intruder think twice before continuing their illegal swim. The installation of the motion-activated lights was simple, but it required a bit of strategic thinking. Sarah placed them near the pool's entrance and along the fence line, so that anyone trying to approach would be bathed in light the moment they crossed into the area. She made sure to set the sensitivity high enough so that even the slightest movement would trigger the lights, but not so sensitive that it would be set off by every gust of wind or passing animal. Once the lights were in place, Sarah stood back and tested them. As soon as she walked across the yard, the lights flickered on, illuminating the entire pool area. It was exactly what she needed. Now, anyone who tried to sneak in would be met with blinding light, a glaring warning that they had been caught in the act. Sarah could already imagine the shock and discomfort her neighbors would feel if they tried to trespass again. It was a deterrent, a reminder that they were no longer hidden in the shadows. For a moment, Sarah felt a flicker of satisfaction. She had taken action, secured her property, and created a plan that would make it much harder for her neighbors to continue their behavior. But deep down, she knew the real test was yet to come. The lock and lights would only be effective if they actually worked, and if her neighbors respected her boundaries. There was still the possibility that they would ignore the signs, that they would try to find another way in. And if that happened, Sarah would need to be prepared for the next step. But for now, Sarah felt a sense of relief. She had done what she could for the moment. The pool was protected, the gate was secure, and she had made her stand. As she walked back inside her house and closed the door behind her, she allowed herself a brief moment of quiet triumph. The next time she cleaned her pool, the water would stay clean. She was confident of that. And if her neighbors tried to sneak in again, they would be met with the consequences of their actions. The game had changed. Sarah wasn't just the victim of their trespassing anymore. She was now in control of the situation. She had drawn a clear line in the sand, and she wasn't about to let anyone cross it. Sarah had hoped that the changes she had made, securing the gate, installing motion-activated lights, would be enough to deter her neighbors from trespassing in her pool. But after a week of carefully monitoring the situation, her hope was crushed. Every time she checked her pool, it was still the same. The water was murky and dirty, as though someone had used it despite her best efforts. The new lock didn't stop them. The lights, while effective in illuminating the area, hadn't proven to be much of a deterrent. The neighbors, now almost invisible figures in the dark of night, had found their way around these measures, slipping into her backyard as if they had every right to be there. Sarah could feel the frustration rising in her chest. It was as if her personal space had been violated again and again, with no regard for the effort she had put into protecting it. Her home was supposed to be her sanctuary, a place of peace, free from the intrusion of others. But now, her sense of security was eroding day by day. She needed to do more. The gentle approaches hadn't worked, and the lock and lights had only delayed the inevitable. Her neighbors were persistent, and their disregard for her privacy was clear. If she wanted to stop them, she would have to be more forceful, more clever in her approach. As Sarah paced around her backyard, looking at the pool that she had worked so hard to maintain, an idea began to form. What if she could make it impossible for them to continue using the pool? What if there was a way to create a visible deterrent, one that would leave no doubt in anyone's mind that the pool was off limits? It would need to be something that wasn't easy to ignore, something that would make them think twice before ever stepping foot in her backyard again. The solution came to her unexpectedly as she was standing by the pool, looking down at the water. She could use chemicals, special chemicals that would change the water's color, rendering it unappealing and, more importantly, unmistakable. If someone tried to sneak into the pool, they would be greeted with a shocking sight. The water would turn a bright, unnatural hue, marking their trespassing in a way that could not be denied. Sarah was familiar with the idea of pool chemicals. As an interior designer, she had worked with a number of clients who had pools, and she had learned a few things about maintenance and care along the way. But she had never thought of using chemicals in this way. This would be a drastic measure, one that would force her trespassing neighbors to face the consequences of their actions. She began researching chemical solutions that could alter the color of the water. It didn't take long for her to discover that there were indeed products available that could change the hue of pool water temporarily. Some were used for pool maintenance to check for chlorine levels, while others were meant for novelty purposes, like creating glowing pools at night. But what caught Sarah's attention was a product that would turn the water a bright, unsettling color when introduced, making it impossible for anyone to ignore. It was perfect. The more she thought about it, the more confident Sarah became in her plan. The pool was an important part of her home, and she wasn't going to let anyone disrespect that. If her neighbors were going to keep sneaking into her space, they would face the consequences, whether they liked it or not. The next day, Sarah went to the local pool supply store and purchased the chemicals she needed. She chose a formula that would turn the water a vivid neon green, bright enough to be visible from every angle. It would be impossible to miss, especially if someone was using the pool at night when the lighting was dim. Sarah also picked up warning signs about the chemical's potential toxicity, which she would place around the pool area. She needed to make it clear that any tampering with the water was not only dangerous but illegal. Once she had everything, she returned home and immediately set to work. She added the chemical to the pool, watching as the water slowly changed color. The once clear water morphed into an unnatural green that glowed under the afternoon sun. Sarah stood back, admiring her work. The pool was now a glaring signal. Anyone who entered it would be met with a shocking surprise, one that would be hard to explain away. It was an unambiguous statement that this pool was off limits. With the chemical in place, Sarah turned her attention to the warning signs. She printed out several large, bold signs that read, "Warning, chemicals used in pool water. Swimming is dangerous and unauthorized." She placed them strategically around the pool, making sure they were visible from every corner of the yard. She wanted to leave no room for misinterpretation. If anyone tried to use the pool now, they would be fully aware of the risks and the consequences. Sarah stepped back and surveyed the pool area once more. Everything was in place. She could already imagine the look on her neighbors' faces if they tried to sneak in again. The sight of the bright green water would be enough to make them reconsider their actions. But it wasn't just about the water. It was about sending a message. This was her property, and she would do whatever it took to protect it. That night, Sarah kept a close watch on the security cameras. The lights were still in place, and she was eager to see if the new measures would make a difference. The minutes ticked by, and the hours passed slowly, but Sarah's eyes never left the screen. She knew that if anyone tried to sneak in, the chemical in the pool would do its job, and she would finally be able to stop them once and for all. Around midnight, Sarah saw movement on the camera. There in the shadows was a figure creeping towards the gate. It was one of her neighbors. Sarah could tell by the familiar outline. The figure stopped for a moment, checking to see if anyone was watching. Sarah's pulse quickened. Would the new measures work? Would this be the moment when her neighbors finally got the message? The figure reached for the gate, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The moment of truth was here. To her relief, the neighbors stopped. They hesitated, their hand lingering on the gate's lock. Sarah could see them glance towards the pool, and then, just as quickly, they turned and walked away. The next morning, Sarah checked the security footage again. There was no sign of anyone using the pool. She smiled, a wave of relief washing over her. The chemical had worked. The bright green water had done its job, and the trespassers had been deterred. For now, at least, her pool was safe. Sarah knew, however, that she couldn't rest on her laurels. If her neighbors were willing to cross boundaries once, they might try again. But for now, she had won, and the victory felt sweet. She had taken drastic action, and it had worked. Her home, her space, her pool, these were hers to protect. After the chemical change and the strategically placed warning signs, Sarah spent the next few days anxiously checking her security footage. She couldn't help but wonder if her bold, new strategy would work. She had invested time, energy, and even a bit of her savings into making sure her pool remained her own personal sanctuary, and she wasn't about to let anyone ruin that. But despite her careful planning, she had no guarantees that her neighbors would stop trespassing. The first few nights after the chemical treatment were quiet. At first, Sarah was skeptical. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe the trespassers had simply stopped using the pool on their own. But as the days passed, she grew more and more confident that the deterrent had worked. The green water remained undisturbed, and the pool area stayed as pristine as it had been after her cleaning session. Then, one evening, Sarah checked the cameras and saw something that brought her a deep sense of satisfaction. As the figure approached her gate, the familiar hesitation appeared. She watched as the neighbor, who had previously tried to sneak in under the cover of night, paused at the entrance, their hand hovering near the lock. Their eyes swept towards the pool, and Sarah could see the slight recoil, the way they quickly glanced away and turned back toward the path. The neighbor did not enter. It was the moment Sarah had been waiting for. The sight of her trespasser, who had once been so bold and unapologetic, turning away in the face of her determined, no-nonsense defenses, was the affirmation she needed. Her strategy had worked. The pool was off limits, and her efforts to protect her space had paid off. In the days that followed, Sarah noticed something else. The previously frequent late-night visitors to her backyard had stopped altogether. No more shadows creeping around her property at odd hours. No more dirty pool water. It was as though her neighbors had finally understood the consequences of their actions. The bright, neon green water had been a clear, inescapable sign that she was serious. The trespassers were gone, and her private space was hers once more. For Sarah, the results were exactly what she had hoped for. She had protected her privacy without having to involve the police. She had taken matters into her own hands, standing firm in her decision to safeguard her home. It hadn't been an easy path, and there had been moments when she wondered if she was overreacting, but in the end, her resolve had paid off. She hadn't let her neighbors' behavior go unchecked. She hadn't given in to the pressure to be nice, or to simply accept that her personal space was no longer hers to enjoy in peace. Sarah had drawn a firm line, and her determination had ensured that it was respected. There was a sense of quiet pride in Sarah as she looked out over her pool in the early morning light, its water clear once again, free from the marks of unwanted visitors. She had learned something important through this whole experience. Protecting one's rights, especially personal ones, required not just strength but clarity of purpose. Sometimes, doing what was right meant standing firm, even when others might criticize or question you. Sarah had taken a stand, and in doing so, she had earned back her peace. But she had also learned that doing what was right wasn't always easy. The first time she had noticed the dirty pool water, She had hoped it was just a fluke, a minor inconvenience that would soon pass. When it didn't, she had hesitated, unsure if she should take things to the next level. Should she confront her neighbors? Should she call the police? It would have been easier to ignore the problem, to let things slide. But Sarah knew that if she did that, she would be giving up her own right to privacy and peace. She had to take control of the situation herself without waiting for someone else to make it right. As much as she had worried about what others might think of her actions, about how her neighbors might react or how the neighborhood might judge her, Sarah now understood that being confident in her decisions, even in the face of potential criticism, was essential. People often spoke about personal boundaries, about protecting oneself, but it wasn't always so simple to put those words into action. It took resolve. It took confidence. And sometimes, it took going beyond what was comfortable to make sure that those boundaries were respected. Her actions weren't about creating conflict. They were about preserving the integrity of her own life, her own personal space. She wasn't going to let others take that from her, and she wasn't going to be afraid of criticism if it meant doing what was right. The community around her had witnessed the shift in Sarah's approach. Some of her neighbors had even made remarks about the sudden change in the pool's appearance, but none of them dared to challenge her decision. They saw, in Sarah's quiet, resolute actions, a woman who knew her rights and wasn't afraid to protect them. They might not have agreed with her methods, but there was no denying the result. The pool was no longer an area of invasion for them. It was hers and hers alone. As Sarah walked around her backyard, enjoying the peaceful solitude once more, she realized that this whole experience had taught her something deeper than just the value of protecting her property. It had shown her the power of taking control of her own life, of standing firm in the face of adversity, and of trusting her instincts when it came to what was right for her. This wasn't just a story about a pool. It was a story about asserting one's right to privacy, to peace, and to personal space. It was a story about making sure that others understood that some lines, once drawn, should not be crossed. And most importantly, it was a reminder that sometimes the most difficult battles are those that we fight for ourselves, not for anyone else, but for our own well-being, our own peace of mind. Sarah had won, and in winning, she had come to understand the quiet strength that came from knowing when to stand firm and when to let go. Her neighbors had finally learned the lesson she had set out to teach them: respect her space, respect her rights, and there would be no issue. Disrespect that space, and there would be consequences. It was as simple as that. As she looked out over her pool for the last time, Sarah felt a sense of calm. The waters were clear, the yard was quiet, and for the first time in a long time she could truly relax.